Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, government, politics, business, education, anything that gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass at CompassKnox.com, joined as always by Scott Barker, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing, Scott?
Oh, I'm doing just great. Going into the holiday weekend, Juneteenth coming up, and then, of course, Father's Day. And so, happy Father's Day to you.
Happy Father's Day to you. Happy Father's Day to Seth. We got three dads sitting here in the room.
Yeah. And so it's all one big happy dad fest here. And
plus, we're going to change the name of the podcast to that. Happy Dad Fest.
Happy Dad Fest.
I'll go try to secure that sponsorship because they do that seltzer or whatever.
And of course, we're getting ready to do one of our periodic expansions of Compass's footprint here soon. So that's going to be. I'll be staying here, and
yes, I might as well go ahead and say up front, I will not be on the podcast next week because I will be elsewhere doing other things, taking a little jaunt overseas. Hopefully, everything goes well. This is the third time since the pandemic hit that my wife and I have planned a trip to Europe. The previous two both got canceled by outbreaks of COVID in the places that we were planning to go to that then locked down and we couldn't go to them. That does not appear to be likely this time, so feeling fairly optimistic, although as we know, travel in general these days can be fraught. So knock on whatever, but I will be back on the podcast in 2 weeks and let you know how that all goes. And next week, Scott and Seth will kind of keep things rolling here.
Yeah, you guys are going to be stuck with us, so hopefully we'll be able to carry on while Jesse is away. And
if you're one of these listeners who just hits fast forward every time we get to a part where I'm talking a lot, you're in luck. Next week you won't have to deal with that at all.
No, they just have to deal with my accent and my voice made for print.
Your authenticity.
Well, there you go.
Your Southern Appalachian authenticity. We're going to actually talk a little bit about Southern Appalachia in a way, because among the things that happened this week was we lost Cormac McCarthy, a major voice in American literature and very much in Southern Appalachian literature as well. We'll also be talking about the official groundbreaking for the downtown stadium. A decision, or a preliminary decision by City Council on relaxing some parking requirements to spur redevelopment in certain areas. And to start us all off, I wanted to talk a little bit about something we wrote about this past week, which came to light in an interesting way. So Hallsdale-Powell Utility District, which serves the northern portion of Knox County, kind of stretching, as the name would suggest, from Powell to Halls, including high school, takes in some slivers of Anderson County and Union County, it provides water and sewer service, that's all, to about 32,000 households. They are under state investigation. And in fact, the state investigation just kind of apparently wrapped up last week when I called HPUD. What's the best way to refer
I don't
to
know.
that? But I called.
I'll tell you one thing. Many of the people that I know in the Halls area have names for Hallsdale-Powell that we can't.
We actually can say, because it's a podcast, we can
yeah,
say whatever we want, but it wouldn't be polite.
It would not be polite, yes.
Yeah, no, they have had a lot of issues with customer dissatisfaction for years, which is part of what is driving all of this. But when I talked to HPUD last week, they said, yes, the state investigators from the comptroller's office have just been here. They were just finishing up their work, so there will be a report coming forth in a few months. And the background to all of this, it actually started in April. We didn't hear about it because, I mean, we try to cover and pay attention to as many sort of branches and tendrils of local and state government as we can. But there is a board called the Utility Management Review Board, which is under the comptroller's office. Not a body that we typically pay a lot of attention to or honestly necessarily knew about the existence of. But they had a meeting in April where one of the officers or administrators from the comptroller's office basically said, I want to go and do an investigation of Hallsdale-Powell Utility District, and here's why. He cited several concerns. But we heard about it because Knox County Commissioner Rhonda Lee, who represents that area and campaigned last year partly on promises to try to hold Hallsdale-Powell accountable for all of the different things that people are upset at them for, she put out a press release basically heralding this investigation, saying, I'm very happy this investigation is happening. And that was the first time I heard of it. I think that was the first time anybody heard that this was going on. There had been no sort of public discussion of it beforehand. So, people will make jokes sometimes about press release journalism where, people just kind of sit around and wait for press releases to come in to tell them what to write about. And we do not practice press release journalism. However, press releases can be sources of information, in this case, telling us, hey, there's this investigation going on. So I went back and actually watched. You can find the video online. It is a public body. Their meetings are public, of the Utility Review Board, and watched this meeting from April. It was very interesting. And basically the concerns that they are looking into have to do with excess ongoing water loss in that district and also their debt level. And those things are related. And basically the deal with Hallsdale-Powell, as you say, it's been an issue of dissatisfaction among their customers for years and years, is that they are a very old, small, rural utility district. That's how they were founded. I forget exactly when, 1940s-ish, first half of the 20th century.
Yeah, back when there was basically nothing except Hall's Crossroads, which was very small, north of Black Oak Ridge.
That's right. It was mostly serving rural areas and initially, and, providing water and sewer service. And they have their stations up on Norris Lake there. And they, over the years, have had a growing population that they have to serve because, of course, that whole area has gotten built up and is continuing to get built up over time. So now they're up to serving more than 30,000 households. And you can find people who will tell you different stories about who exactly is to blame, but nobody really disputes that basically they built the system and didn't do a lot of improvements to it for years and years and years and years. And the pipes got old and got more demand and strain placed on them. And basically the system that they have is just not sufficient to serve the people who they are now serving. And so they've been in a position for about 20 years of trying to retrofit this system, go back and replace aging, broken pipes, and just kind of upgrade the entire system, make it more modern and build its capacity and so forth. But it's taking a long time to do all that because, utilities, I mean, we see this with Knoxville Utilities Board has been doing upgrades to their pipes, their water and sewer service across the city, and especially the core of Knoxville where they had, some pipes that were 100 years old or more. And so we've seen with that, it's a big deal. Like to replace, 200 feet of pipe even takes a tremendous amount of work and effort. You got to dig it up. You got to dig the trench. You got to take all the safety protocols to make sure like nobody dies while you're doing this. And then you got to replace it. And I mean, it's a lot of work. It's very expensive. And so as Hallsdale-Powell has been trying to retrofit it, they're kind of like, trying to get caught up, but then their population that they're serving keeps growing. And so they've kind of been in that cycle. And then to pay for all of that, of course, Scott, how can utilities pay their bills?
Well, the only way that utilities can pay their bills is by charging their customers.
That's right. Ratepayers.
Yep.
They don't get taxpayer funding. Sometimes they're kind of quasi-public entities. They are regulated by the state, but they have to pay for their own operations. They don't have any other source of funds. So as they have had to make all of these investments, they have had to borrow money to do that. That has pushed their debt levels up very high. And to pay for all of this, it has pushed their rate levels up. And on top of that, over the years in certain places, people have complained about, they haven't even been getting good service. And, the water pressure is not sufficient and so forth. So they've been in a pickle, I guess you could say, for a while. People have been unhappy for a while. And that is what has led to this state investigation now. Basically, there was a customer complaint a couple of years ago specifically about the rates, and the comptroller's office came in and looked at it and said, well, the rates are high, but so are their expenses, and so, the rates are justified on the basis of what they actually have to pay for. But they came back and looked at it, and the thing that really kind of triggered this broader look is one of the key measures of efficiency in a water system is how much water gets from point A to point B, whether that's your garden hose or your toilet or your shower or whatever, and is then charged. You pay for it, which is good for the water system. Ideally, a water system for every gallon that it sends out wants to be getting paid for a gallon
for that
of
gallon,
water.
yes.
And none of them operate at 100%. Water is, in fact, hard to kind of like. Water will take advantage of any place it can go. If there's a tiny little leak, anything like that, every water system deals with water loss. However, the national average is about 14%, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. Last year, Hallsdale-Powell was running at 46%, so like 3 times the national average. Almost half of all of the water that they pushed through their system was non-revenue water. They didn't make any money on it. They spent the money to, generate it, clean it, treat it, all of that, and send it out. And then they didn't get paid for it because now they said part of that is because they have, they do have these very long and old lines that need to be flushed a lot. So anytime you got to flush these lines, of course, that's all water loss. But a lot of it is just leaks and breaks, and they know that, and this has been true for years. But the guy from the comptroller's office who was talking about this at this April meeting said that the problem he sees is that in 2019, that number was about 42%. In 2020, it went up to 45%, and now last year it was at 46%. So he said, I do understand that Hallsdale-Powell is making efforts here, but we're not seeing any progress. They're spending all this money. They have very high debt levels. They're charging their ratepayers a lot to pay for all of this, and it's not getting better. And so this investigation that the state did is basically what they called a holistic look. People from the comptroller's office who understand how utility systems are supposed to run came in and spent a lot of time with Hallsdale-Powell, looked, they were going to look up and down the whole operation. And Hallsdale-Powell completely cooperated with this, and basically their position is these are all things. Yes, this is still the same problem that we know about that we've been trying to fix for a long time. We do have things in process to do this. It's just going to take us a while, and it is going to continue to cost a lot of money. And also Hallsdale-Powell said, our rates are high, but there's 14 other districts in the East Tennessee area that have higher rates. We do have a lot of very small, older utility districts around, many, and traditionally, a lot of your smaller districts operate with your least efficiency. That's true in many things, and it is true in utility districts as well for various reasons. So basically Hallsdale-Powell is saying, yes, we know it's bad and we're sorry and we're working on it. And the state is saying, well, we want to really take a look and make sure that you guys know what you're doing. So we will have that report in a couple of months. We'll see what they have to say. Maybe they'll say, yes, they're doing everything they should. And, the one thing that Darren Cardwell, the general manager of Hallsdale-Powell, told me when I talked to him is that even in the time since that last year's report about the water loss, he says they are now doing better and that they've gotten that loss down under 40% to more like 37, 38%. Still a pretty high number, a lot of lost water. But he says the things they're doing are working. It is going in the right direction. But people out in that area are probably going to continue to be unhappy about their high bills for some time to come, because there's just not really any way around that.
Yeah, of course, I wonder if and I wonder if all of these apparent leaks in the system have anything to do with the pressure issues that some people are complaining about.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
But anyway, it is difficult because it is an older system and it is spread out, and they do have to charge their, when they go in and fix these things, they do have to charge the water customers more. When KUB redid the sanitary sewer system in the first part of the century. Golly, it's weird to say that. But
way back in the double O's.
Of course, they were forced to by the federal government.
Yeah.
But if as KUB customers who actually read their bills know, your wastewater portion of your bill has exploded. If you could look back and see what it was in 2000 and see what it is now, and if you use the same amount of water, essentially, you'll see that it's a lot higher. And
because we're paying for fancy new pipes
and big tanks and all kinds of stuff. But we don't have sewage running in our streets, which we did before that happened. Whenever it rained, obviously it's a different case. But again, the people who get the water service at Hallsdale-Powell will be footing the bill for any upgrades that they end up making.
Yep. Well, we will certainly report on that report when it comes out. But it was an interesting little development there. Okay, we were talking about growth out in the sort of outer parts of the county. Let's talk about redevelopment inside the city, especially inside some of our older urban areas that have had infrastructure, but have had businesses and other people leave over time. So, what is going on with this parking requirement, and why was it an issue for redevelopment in blighted areas?
Well, this gets kind of complicated. So, please, when if you're listening to this, your eyes glaze over. Hold on, they'll unglaze. But in 2017, the city tweaked its parking ordinance, its off-street parking ordinance for commercial buildings, and put in new requirements on what you could do, what parking lots had to look like. There was a companion ordinance that required landscaping perimeter landscaping on parking lots and that sort of thing. And one thing that they did was they put in a requirement that is referred to as the 50% rule. And basically, if you are redeveloping property, as opposed to a new development, if you're redeveloping a property and your renovations to your building basically equal or exceed 50% of its value, then you have to do upgrades to your parking lot. If you don't hit that threshold, you can just leave your parking lot as it is. And you're kind of grandfathered in. But if you hit that 50% mark, then you have to come up to the new standards. And most commercial buildings, especially in the older parts of town, don't currently meet those standards. Because
what do those standards include?
Well, the primary thing is greater setbacks from the street and any side streets. that is a big, of course, the number of parking spaces and that sort of thing, but the real issue is kind of these setbacks. And you might think, okay, well, if your setback has to, if you double the amount of your setback, then, that's just too bad. But that can cause all kinds of problems. Because you have to reconfigure your parking lot. And it's not just losing spaces, which has, one risk there is you reduce your spaces to where it's below the minimum that you're supposed to have for your business. But you also have to reconfigure the interior driving lanes, the lanes between the spaces. And when you reconfigure those, it can make the parking lot basically inoperable. I mean, you really just can't. Some developers just can't do it. It can't be designed that way. It's a round peg square hole thing. But anyway, that's hard enough. And
the goal of all of this, right, is to make parking lots sort of safer, but also kind of more aesthetically incorporate them more within sort of like the urban landscape. Right?
Yeah, and one big component is these buffers need, there's a companion ordinance that requires that they be landscaped. So it adds green space to the city. Little chunks here and there, but it adds green space. One of the goals was to make the large parking lots, these big box stores, if they get redeveloped or whatever, is to get them greener, because instead of having the Vice Mayor Andrew Roberto referred to them as seas of asphalt out there, and so when this ordinance was actually there are two ordinances, but when they were developed, Scenic Knoxville was very involved. There's a lot of public input, and it was really the focus was more on making the city greener than it was on the efficiency of a parking lot. Although that was also part of the discussion. I mean, developers were involved in this too. One of the things that the 50% rule did, and I think this is one of those unintended consequences, is it created huge disparities in renovating. The lower the value of a piece of property, of course, generally the more it needs to be renovated, and it ends up having a lower threshold that triggers all these changes they would have to make, which costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money to dig up an asphalt parking lot, to put in buffers, to landscape those buffers, to have somebody redesign the traffic flow. All that's very expensive, and that adds that expense to the project. And one easy way to look at this is if you have two identical office buildings or retail stores, one on Kingston Pike in, say, the Bearden area, one on Magnolia Avenue, and you look at the relative property values of those, and it's very easy to have the exact same building in Bearden that might be worth $3 million, and the very same building on Magnolia Avenue worth $500,000. And what this is if you have the exact same renovation project, you're going to do the exact same thing to each building, and it costs $400,000. Then, that's obviously over 50% of the $500,000 figure on Magnolia Avenue, and they would have to add a further expense of redesigning, digging up, and rebuilding their parking lot. Whereas the building in Bearden, $400,000 is well below half the value of the property, and they don't have to. Mm-hmm. So developers have been, as according to Peter Ahrens, who's the head of the city's plans review and inspections office, which is what they're the ones who handle these things, saying that people just aren't redeveloping the properties in areas that where their property values are lower, which arguably need more investment, not less. And so people aren't investing in these properties because they can go elsewhere and not incur the additional expense of rebuilding the parking lot.
Right. So it's basically creating disincentives in a place where they actually want to incentivize redevelopment.
And that is the driving force behind this change. There's changes to the two ordinances that I referenced. City Council voted to approve them on first reading last week. Second reading will be next week, and so, but there's some real concerns that by doing this, and there are exceptions and all. It's much more complicated than what I'm breaking it down to as being as simple as possible. But there are concerns that it would not do anything to make the city any greener. And that was a concern that was raised at Planning Commission by Planning Commissioner Amy Midas. It was raised at City Council. And one of the things is they were Joyce Feld, who's the head of Scenic Knoxville, is generally in support of this, but it's not perfect, she said. Several council members said the same thing. One of the issues is they want. There's kind of this idea that you can have some kind of property value thing where properties are worth less than X amount of dollars. You can, they don't have to comply with this, but if they're more, if this is a project they can easily afford to do that, why not require them to do it? The consensus is pretty much so far is they can't find a workable way to do that.
Yeah, that sounds legally tricky. How do
it
you
is
distinguish
legally,
between properties based on their assumed or assessed property value?
You might be able to do it by creating. Of course, you're creating a whole new level of zoning bureaucracy here, but different zones are different. There might be a way to do that, but there are it's real sticky. So anyway, that's the Cliff's Notes version of what's going on there. Like anything to do with zoning and building and all, it's there are nuances and details that I'm sure that some of the that Peter and Joyce all may call in and say, "Hey, Scott, why didn't you mention this? Why didn't you mention that?" Well, try to give a big picture here.
Basically, what they're doing is just taking away that 50%.
It just takes away the 50%.
It would no longer require redevelopment to make.
Right. You would have.
So the ordinances would only apply to new development.
Essentially. So it would only be required for new development. You can always do it. It only be required for new development, or if the building in question, you demolish the building in question.
Because then you're completely changing the property.
Yeah.
Right?
And there are a lot of it. These are supposed to. The changes are also supposed to kick in if you change the use of the building. There are ways out of that. There's some flexibility there. Whereas if you had a building that was a restaurant and you're going to turn it into a retail store or something like that, it might be, it would trigger that requirement. But depending on circumstances, you might be able to get that changed. The engineering department take a look at how the parking lot functions, and you might be able to get a waiver on that. But the idea, as we said, is to make it easier to redevelop properties that are on the lower end of the spectrum in areas of the city that really need more investment, or that could benefit from more investment. And I think that argument will probably end up winning the day. But there are enough questions where it warrants paying attention to in a couple of weeks when they vote on second reading.
All right. Well, speaking of redevelopment, major redevelopment downtown, and interestingly, not one with any parking associated with it at all.
That's one of the problems that people see in this project.
The new downtown stadium, the baseball / soccer / concerts and whatever else may come there stadium, had its official groundbreaking this week. I guess not a whole lot of news here exactly, because work had already started on the site, as anybody who goes by it regularly knows. But this was still significant in that this is something that has been talked about and has been in the works for a long time now. We're going back to the Obama administration, that era. That's how long this has been sort of in the works and part of the public discussion. So, what happened at the groundbreaking?
Well, the groundbreaking was a typical groundbreaking. It was kind of interesting. Like I said, work's been going on already, and they brought looked like fresh dirt from somewhere else. It didn't look like came from there, but this pile of dirt in front of a piece of heavy machinery that has already been doing all the work for the past several weeks or months, and they came in. It was this very symbolic thing, but it it was symbols are can be important, and so they had this groundbreaking. As you said, this is something that's gone back. In fact, there have been people who have talked about the Smokies returning to Knoxville ever since they moved to Sevierville or Kodak right at the turn of the century, the year 2000. I think was their first season in Kodak at Smoky Stadium. So people have wanted them to move back. That was 2 ownership groups ago. They were out of town owners. They moved out from Bill Meyer Stadium to Sevierville or to Kodak, and it's funny. It's Kodak, but it's actually the city of Sevierville too. So it's
right. There's a sliver of the city of Sevierville that runs all the way out there.
Yeah, and kind of finger annexation kind of deal, and the contract's actually with the city of Sevierville and Sevier County. They're the ones who actually own the stadium. Much like Knox County and the city of Knoxville will own this stadium. Anyway. But things have really been work really has been going into it for the past 5 years, and it's been a long process. It's been there was some contention from some quarters, although I think the overall it's received a lot of support, especially from elected officials. There's a huge, public investment in it, and so as with any large public investments over $100 million will be scrutinized and appropriately so. But the actual, and we had the pandemic, we had the huge. We talk about inflation. Personally, inflation in the construction industry was just out of sight over the past year and a half or so, and it's not really abated a whole lot, and so it's really driven up the costs, delayed construction beginning, but they are optimistic that the stadium will move forward and be ready to go in opening day 2025 in the minor league season, and the soon to be renamed Knoxville Smokies will be here. In fact, it was funny at the groundbreaking. Randy Boyd, who's the University of Tennessee president and owner of the Tennessee Smokies, and his wife showed up wearing Smokies baseball jerseys, and he was kind of joking about that, and he said, rush out and get these vintage jerseys, because when we come down here, we're going to have new jerseys for you to buy, and they'll say Tennessee Smoke or Knoxville Smokies, and so ever the salesman, Mr. Boyd. But anyway, at this point, that's moving forward. One of the things that they talked about a lot there was the homage that they're going to be paying to the African American community, black baseball in Knoxville, that history. One of the things that a lot of people, especially the critics of the project, have pointed out is the stadium is being built in the middle of a neighborhood that was raised essentially for urban renewal, beginning in the late 1950s, which was when this particular section began. As a neighborhood that was called the Bottom because it's along the creek bottom of First Creek, and it was so there's a lot of in the Boyd and the stadium people have engaged with the Beck Cultural Exchange Center to make sure that they can find ways to pay tribute to the Bottom and the people that lived there who had to move out involuntarily in the late 1950s and in early 1960s, and so there's a lot of concerted effort to do that. It will probably, I was talking with Bob Booker, who is a writer and historian of Knoxville's black community, and he actually grew up in the Bottom and remembered being displaced, and was talking about going to church, and his first job was at a store that are on the building, on the stadium footprint, and that's where they were located on Florida Street, and he was glad to see something coming in. That was, he said, I've been waiting almost 70 years to see this happen. And it is the hope for, city officials, county officials, and others that it will spur more development in the, what's known as the Magnolia Avenue Warehouse District, which, extends basically from the old city, for a few blocks to the east and then north to Magnolia Avenue, and that, there's a lot of optimism that can happen, and but so that was a big theme of what they talked about during the groundbreaking. As you said, the groundbreaking itself was, we all know it's being built. We all know, if you've been following it, the trials and travails of trying to figure out the funding, the private funding, the public funding, the people have learned more about tax increment financing than they ever wanted to know, and but now the focus is shifting to the actual bricks and mortar and field aspects of this, and it's less than 2 years out now that it would, unless there are unforeseen events, less than 2 years, there will be a new stadium hard by the old city.
And we'll all get to watch it being built, which is, I always just think it's kind of interesting to watch big projects literally from the ground up and kind of see how they come together. And I don't actually know how you build a stadium, so it'll be interesting to see the different phases it goes through. Yeah,
that's one thing that you and I both, because we live in North Knoxville, use Hall of Fame quite a bit. Going to at least I do, going to downtown, and so and I've already every time I go by, take a look over and see if there's anything new yet, if there's anything that's changed, and all that. It will be interesting to watch it come up from nothing but a field of dirt until there's going to be a stadium. There's going to be residential buildings. There's going to be all kinds of stuff, and it'll be interesting to see what it ends up looking like.
And one thing I wanted to mention, because there was some discussion of this on our subscriber Facebook page, the Compass Colloquy, which you can join if you subscribe to Compass, which you can do at CompassKnox.com. But some readers were well, there are some people who have very strong opinions about the stadium, negative ones that don't think there should be any public money going into it, that, basically we're subsidizing a millionaire, which, yes, we are. That's a factual statement. But one of the things I saw somebody say, and I've seen other people say this too, is how can you be doing this when nobody wants it? And here's the thing. If all you knew about this stadium was what you read on social media, you could come to that conclusion, because pretty much anytime anything gets posted about it, negative comments will outweigh positive comments by some huge margin, 19-1 or whatever. Like, it's mostly people saying, giving money to rich guys, do something about, and then, people can list like the whole list of other things they think government should spend money on instead of this. So there is a lot of skepticism that you see online. But I got into a little bit of an argument with a friend last year who posted something saying, this is the least popular project I've ever seen. And I believe she was getting most of that impression from what she has seen on social media. You and I have been covering this from the beginning at the public meetings where there's been workshops and discussion and votes, multiple votes, city council, county commission, then to the sports authority. And I have to say that there has, in fact, been remarkably little pushback against this project publicly. There's been essentially no organized public resistance. Early on, there were a couple of people who set up Facebook pages, but those never turned into, as I said to somebody on our Facebook page yesterday, there are neighborhood rezonings that bring out larger, angrier crowds than any public discussion of the stadium ever has. And you can say, okay, well, people who show up at public meetings is not a good way to gauge public sentiment, and that is certainly true. Although it is one gauge, and you and I know that, like, when people are really mad about things, they do show up, because we see that happen a lot. And that really hasn't happened much with the stadium. There's been sort of like a small, consistent group of people who show up at meetings, but it's a fairly small group with no sign of sort of like broader organization or a real grassroots movement against it. But beyond that, if you look politically, basically everybody serving in office right now in the city and county, Mayor Kincannon, Mayor Jacobs in the county commissioners, city council members, almost all of them got elected on platforms of either supporting the stadium or at least saying, yes, I'm open to this project. Most of them voted for it, all of county commission and most of city council. And we have had subsequent waves of elections, both with county commission last year and city council the year before that, of people facing voters again after they had voted to support the stadium. Not only did all of them get reelected easily, almost none of their opponents even raised the stadium as an issue, or if it came up for discussion, their opponents would say, oh, I think it's a good thing. Maybe we could have done things a little bit better, whatever. Again, just like, if this really was this hugely unpopular project that, Facebook might make you think it is, it would show up somewhere. Yeah. It would show up in people coming to meetings. It would show up on the campaign trail. And it really hasn't. And so none of that means that everybody loves it. But I just think it's always a mistake to think that, people being mad on Facebook actually reflects something real in kind of the real political world.
Yeah. As you mentioned there, you've got this, people coming to public meetings isn't always a reliable gauge. Is a gauge. And the same goes probably even more so for social media. And one of the things that is apparent is that, it's very easy to, express anger on social media more than anything else, joy for that matter. It's very easy to express it there, but it's a different animal altogether to, organize, opposition to something. One of the things that you remember, I know you'll remember this, when the proposal for the for county-owned property on State Street was a planetarium in University of Knoxville, and there was a lot of public money that was going to have to go into that. More people had probably showed up at one meeting about opposing University of Knoxville than have showed up at in opposition to the stadium at all the public meetings combined.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a real, and University of Knoxville obviously did not go through.
Yeah.
It was killed. And, so you're right. I think it's very easy to pick up on, people who for legitimate reasons are opposed to something, but that's not the same as an organized, widespread opposition to something, and we just didn't see that.
Yeah, and American Cannon is running for re-election this year, having been a strong proponent of the stadium. Maybe some of her opponents will raise this, and we'll see what happens there. But so far, everybody who has supported this, people have gotten elected saying, I support the stadium. Then they have supported the stadium. Then they have run for re-election, and they've gotten reelected. Again, we're not saying that everybody loves the stadium. There is no reliable public polling that I'm aware of on the issue. But I do think that it's very hard to make a case that there's some sort of widespread opposition to it, because there has not been widespread opposition to it. It just hasn't been there.
Well, and the time for stopping the project is long gone.
Yeah.
Actually longer than a year now, almost 2 years.
But also a very different situation than we've seen in Nashville, where they are going ahead with that new extremely expensive stadium for the Titans. But that has been extremely unpopular.
Yes.
There is polling there. There have been packed public meetings with people just railing against it as a bad deal and a bad idea. And that, we just haven't seen that. That has not been the experience here. Okay. Well, now I just wanted to take a couple minutes to talk about Cormac McCarthy, because, first of all, he's a great writer who I personally, admire. I have not read all of his books. I've read a lot of his books, and I have not loved all of the books of his that I've read, but I have really loved some of them and found at least all of them interesting, because, even when you think he's maybe losing the thread a little bit, he's always a really fun writer, just from the kind of pure language that he uses, the ways he uses language. But he's also a very important Knoxville figure. And, his relationship to Knoxville in the last many decades has been a literally and metaphorically distant one. He grew up, he wasn't born here, but he grew up here, lived here almost his whole childhood, graduated from Knoxville Catholic High School, went to the University of Tennessee twice without earning a degree. And
that's not an unfamiliar story.
Yeah. Yes, lots of people do that. Fewer people who do that then go on to dedicate themselves to an almost monastic life of writing. If you read about his early decades as a writer, living in kind of a shack in South Knoxville on essentially no money, relying on a succession of a couple of wives, I think, to kind of keep him from starving to death, and a difficult guy maybe by a lot of accounts, but rooted right here in Knoxville. And his early books were all set in and around East Tennessee, and of course culminating with Suttree, which came out in 1979 and is about the most Knoxville book ever. I guess the one you could set alongside it is James Agee's A Death in the Family, which also is very much about the city at a specific place and time. Although
Suttree is kind of the dark underbelly of A Death in the Family.
Suttree is the it's set in it was published in the late 70s, but it's set in the early 1950s. It's set right around the era that who was it? John Gunther came through and called Knoxville the ugliest city in America. And when you read Suttree, you kind of
that's a pretty ugly place he's living in there. So.
But just fascinating characters in that book, and this great visceral sense of the city that he grew up in, that he knew very intimately. And then of course he moved west, and his whole latter career, most of the books were set in the West. He lived in Texas and then for many, many years in Santa Fe. But he had family still here. His brother, Dennis McCarthy, and Dennis's wife, Judy, were prominent attorneys in Knoxville for decades. Many people, they eventually moved to Santa Fe as well, but many people in Knoxville, still know them and maintain ties with them. And so as all the tributes to Cormac came through this past week, locally, there were also a lot of people, expressing love and support to the McCarthy family, people who actually are from here and who people here know. And so even though Cormac himself, he did come back to Knoxville periodically, especially when he still had family members living here, but never publicly. I know
he didn't do very much publicly at all.
Right. He famously hated interviews. When Oprah Winfrey decided to make his 2006 book, The Road, one of her selections, which was good news for him because it helped turn it into one of his best sellers. He had a couple of books that really sold a lot, were big hits, and that was one of them. But the price for that was he had to go on the Oprah show and subject himself to an interview, which you can find online. It's a good interview, and he did fine in it, but that was not his thing. So I know of lots of local organizations of various kinds over the years that have made tentative efforts to, maybe we could get Cormac McCarthy to come and do some big Knoxville thing. And it was just always like, no. It's like,
don't even try.
That is not going to happen. But despite, or maybe to some degree because of that, he over time has built up a real sort of Knoxville fan base, cult. You could say there have been a lot of McCarthy-themed events here over the years. There was an international McCarthy conference that was held here at one point. You and I have been fortunate to participate in some various kinds of walking tours and public readings and things of McCarthy's work over the years. I will not be surprised if something like that happens again sometime in the not too distant future, especially with all of the renewed attention that his death has kind of brought to him. But, he's you can't really exaggerate his stature. I mean, I saw somebody, a major literary Twitter person posted yesterday, well, with Toni Morrison and Cormac McCarthy gone, who's in the running for greatest living American novelist? And so, that's the level Cormac McCarthy was at, greatest living American novelist.
Yeah, he's kind of beloved here among people who are interested in literature, essentially, because of Suttree and his early works that were set in East Tennessee, but particularly Suttree, because it does paint such a vivid picture of Knoxville. But he, won the National Book Award, won Pulitzer Prize. He was even before I read Suttree in the mid '80s, and up and knew about McCarthy, knew how great he was. I would have, killed to be able to write one sentence as powerful as something that he has written. And but it was very much a cult-like thing. Even in the broader literary community, he was highly regarded as being among America's greatest novelists. Long before he got famous, he went up until his novel All the Pretty Horses, which was turned into a movie that a lot of people had introduction to him. Up until then, he'd never sold a book, never sold more than 5,000 copies in hardcover of his books ever.
Yeah.
And,
that's like 30 years, because his first book came out in 1965, The Orchard Keeper, and All the Pretty Horses is 92. So that's almost 30 years of toiling in sort of well-regarded poverty.
Yeah. And in fact, the book that he wrote, that many critics say is one of the greatest American novels, Blood Meridian, was written before All the Pretty Horses came out, and nobody read it. And why say nobody? I did, but very few people, had read Blood Meridian, and yet in the literary world, it's considered a masterpiece.
Yeah. It now routinely makes lists of the greatest American novels ever. And, it's one of these books that sets out to be sort of self-consciously sets out to be a great American novel. I mean, he's telling the story of the West, essentially, through this surprisingly, if you go back and look at it, surprisingly fact-based narrative of this kind of band of violent Indian hunters, essentially, in the late 1800s. It is an extraordinarily violent and disturbing book in a lot of ways, but also just like amazingly written and has it. I don't know anybody who's read Blood Meridian who doesn't still kind of carry the impact of it with them. Yeah,
it's a very powerful novel, and one of the things about McCarthy too is his world that he writes about is incredibly violent, and it's but beautifully rendered, and his prose is almost biblical at times, very. You need to have a dictionary with you for the most part if you're reading him, because you'll be consulting it. His vocabulary is just breathtaking, and sometimes it gets a little pretentious, but for the most part,
he's very easy to parody.
Yes,
but the fact that he's very easy to parody just is also sort of testament to the strength of his style. Like you know it immediately.
Yeah, in the same way that Hemingway was easy to parody and Faulkner was easy to parody, but one of the things about his work is that there's an overarching thing is it's always a struggle of good and evil, and evil has the upper hand. Evil is strong and relentless and vicious, and the good is rare and must be vigilantly maintained, and often is subdued.
Yep.
And it's not a world for the faint of heart, but it is an extraordinary world when it's focused on East Tennessee, as his early books were, or on the American West, like Blood Meridian, or the post-apocalyptic future, like The Road. He kind of spans it all there.
And it's worth mentioning that in The Road, which is sort of a road story, I mean, it's a father and son kind of traveling through the devastated American landscape after something very bad has happened. They, at one point, come to a city that is obviously Knoxville. It's not named in the book, but you can very much tell it's Knoxville. They walk across the Henley Bridge. And even in his final books that were released last year, The Passenger and Stella Maris, he had mentions of Knoxville in those books too. Not always complimentary mentions of Knoxville, but Knoxville was an important part of him that even after he left here, he very much kept within himself.
Well, I think that he had a very complicated relationship with Knoxville, I believe is a nice way to put it. I think that he hated a lot of what Knoxville was, and but he also recognized it also is a part of him, or was a part of him, and he did go back, and there were references. The characters had been from East Tennessee. They might be out west, but they were from the Knoxville area essentially, and so it's a love-hate relationship there, but it's which is okay, because a lot of people have love-hate relationships with the places they grew up in.
Absolutely. and especially somebody like McCarthy, who, like, by his own account, was not an enthusiastic student. You get the sense that, I mean, to the degree that Suttree is semi-autobiographical, I mean, Suttree is the story of a guy from an affluent Knoxville family who walks away from all of it and goes and lives in a crummy little boat down on a filthy river. Hangs out with drunkards and ne'er-do-wells. One interesting thing about Suttree, I think, from our standpoint, is that it ends, and again, it's set in the early 50s. ends at a scene of, and it's just kind of described in the background, but if you understand the setting, you know what's going on. The interstate being constructed right through the middle of some of the areas that the book is set in, some of the areas and neighborhoods and places that Suttree frequents are literally being bulldozed at the end of the book.
McAnally Flats.
McAnally Flats, it kind of right where the interstate comes through there, just west of downtown. And, I think that it was fitting that it was McCarthy's last East Tennessee book, because you sort of got the sense that the East Tennessee that he valued in a way, or that he felt was most real, was maybe giving way. And the modern world kind of was coming in. Suttree is sort of like a pre-modern Knoxville. And then the modern world that we now inhabit is coming in, and he was sort of done with Knoxville. He'd
leave that to somebody else.
Right, exactly. So anyway, R.I.P. Cormac McCarthy.
Absolutely.
Great writer, and if you have not read his work, now is as good a time as any. All right, Seth, why don't we take a quick break here, and we will come back and do our Q&A. Okay, we are back. Now it's time for the Q&A portion of our podcast, where we go onto our subscriber-only Facebook page, as we mentioned before, and ask people if there's any particular issues, items, things they would like to hear discussed or want updates on. One of the questions we got relates to something we've talked about a fair amount here recently, which is this idea of the missing middle housing, the kind of like affordable housing that we don't have enough of for, young professionals, people making sort of low to medium wages, and these it can take a lot of different forms. It can be in the form of things like townhouses that we talked about some last week, or apartments, or town center type developments that often have a little more density to them, which gives you better value per unit. Essentially, you can house people more cheaply in places with more density. And so the question was, there's a lot of talk about this. Is anybody actually doing anything about it? There was a study done by the Planning Commission, but what are the city and county actually doing on the ground to try to create more of this kind of housing? This kind of housing, and it's not only income wise, but it's also size wise, because most of the housing that our zoning codes allow, most of it is single family housing that you think of as suburban subdivisions or older city neighborhoods. A house on a lot. That's or big apartment buildings. The missing middle that they talk about are things like duplexes and triplexes, kind of garden, smaller apartment complexes, maybe 12 units instead of 150 or whatever, that can fit into regular neighborhoods. And that's one of the things that this study that the Planning Commission and the City of Knoxville teamed up to fund looked at is being able to incorporate those types of housing into existing neighborhoods. This is the city side of it, especially. Now these types of developments typically are meet with a lot of resistance, because a lot of residents in these neighborhoods they think that it's going to harm their property values. They don't want to destroy the character of their neighborhood, these kinds of things. But the study, looked at basically being able to blend in these types of developments with existing neighborhoods. One of the key things that the study came up with was, you don't need to do this all over the city. It really is best if you do it really close to
areas that are walkable, that are already have commercial developments, places that that people who live in in a way, these could also almost be transitional type developments to the single family neighborhoods from a commercial corridor or node, as node has become a favorite word of planners. That's kind of one of the the strategies that they had suggested. So as far as what's going on now, you haven't heard anything. I mean, the study came out earlier this year and was kicked around. They had a work session on it in city council. Well, now is the time for the behind the scenes stuff. And what they're doing is city officials are looking at the study. They're looking at the city. They're looking at where and how they might be able to encourage this development. Most likely it's going to be through zoning. They're going to have to change the zoning in some of these areas because one of the things is lot size and the footprint of the building and all these things that are regulated basically prevent things like duplexes and triplexes and smaller apartment buildings now. Some of the older neighborhoods have older developments that are like that. I live in a North Knoxville neighborhood, and 1 block from my house is a small apartment complex. Actually, there are 2 of them within a block or 2 of my house that are small. They would not be allowed. New ones would not be allowed under the current zoning ordinance, and but they're looking at ways to do that, and I don't want to make predictions on when, but it could be before the end of the year that the city council will be considering something. I don't know where that's going to go. Don't know if it'll be on one certain area just to see how it goes. Because one of the things is this will be allowed in the city. It's going to be mostly infill development, where there might be a house that is in North Knoxville or East Knoxville or somewhere Fort Sanders for that matter that gets condemned and it gets torn down, and then can you put a duplex there? Right now you can't, but so this would be limited geographically to areas within convenient walking distance of commercial areas, and limited to essentially to infill housing, because all these areas are grown up in the city. So it's so it would be you wouldn't see a dramatic change. You'd see change over time if this gets if it gets implemented. But I would say that before the end of the year, there will probably be, if not a zoning revision ordinance that comes before council, at least more an idea, proposal that could end up being what gets adopted, if anything gets adopted in the city. Now, of course, the other side of this is Knox County, because Knox County is also everywhere in Knox County needs more housing. I mean, everybody agrees on that. And Jesse, what is the landscape on the city or on the county side of this?
Right. Well, so the biggest thing that's going on in the county is the Advanced Knox project, which we've talked about, which is basically their updating of their general plan, which will then be followed by updates to their zoning ordinance, as you were just talking about in the city. But similarly to the city, there's discussion in the Advanced Knox project about providing a greater variety of housing types. And one interesting thing in that project has been, as they have gone out and presented various options for future growth at public meetings and sought feedback on them, the most popular options have been a lot of people saying basically we want diversity of housing. We don't want just one kind of housing. Most of the growth outside the city, as you said, has been single family subdivisions, just basically plow under the field and put in a subdivision and then keep doing the same thing all down the road. And there's lots of corridors out through the county that just have sort of one subdivision after another. Less common, but you do see them, are large apartment complexes. Those do exist outside the city as well, most often, sort of in relative proximity to the interstate or commercial areas or whatever. But again, not very much of the kind of small scale density that you're talking about with missing middle housing. And that is one of the things in these scenarios presented under Advanced Knox that they have included is, would you like to see developments that have either a range of these options within a development or, that have a range of options across multiple developments. And that has been the most popular option. People have not been coming out and saying, yes, we want to continue only building single family home subdivisions forever. People recognize that there's a demand for a range of different kinds. Not everybody wants that big house with the big lawn or is in a position to pay for it. And so I think we're only a month or two away probably from getting final recommendations on that Advanced Knox, from that Advanced Knox process, which would then lead to a new countywide plan being adopted. And I believe they are going to work to include these kinds of options in there. Like if you're and outside the city, you're not talking about infill development. You're mostly talking about greenfield development. And so I think part of the challenge there for the county is incentivizing developers who are used to fairly, one model of development, to think more holistically about how can you provide other kinds of housing. And, one example of this that we've talked about is that gigantic Belltown development out there on Emory Road, which could be a bit of a model of this in that it's going to include a lot of single family housing. It is doing sort of traditional subdivision type development. But then we'll also have a portion of the development that will have some density, some townhouses, some apartments, some commercial area. And so I think that is an example of the kind of thing that we might see more of outside of the city, is developments that do still include, nobody's doing away with the single family subdivision model, but that it can kind of coexist with some of these other options, which if you had enough of that spread across the whole county, ideally, you would have housing for anybody, housing at multiple price points and size and space and lifestyle and whatever. So I think that's a big goal of Advanced Knox, is to try to create just more diversity of housing outside the city. Mm-hmm. So, we will continue to talk about all that and track it. I mean, as you say, these things are likely to happen. None of this is going to happen all at once. Yeah. It's going to happen on a sort of development by development basis, happen or not happen, I guess, on a development by development basis. And we will just see how all that goes. All right, let's take a quick look ahead to the coming week. It starts off with a holiday, Monday, Juneteenth, now a federal, state, and local holiday. It has been formally adopted by governments at all levels. So for one thing, that means all of our government offices are going to be closed on Monday. There are a couple of events happening. The MLK Parade, which used to happen in January as part of the week of events that the local MLK Commemorative Commission organizes. They moved that parade to June a few years ago, which probably a lot of people are happy about because it could be pretty cold in January. Yeah. Lots of public officials like to go and march in the parade. And when I worked for the city, I went with Mayor O'Hara to that parade several times. And it can be chilly. January in East Tennessee, it can be chilly. Of course, June in East Tennessee, it can be hot, but probably some people prefer that. So anyway, that parade will happen Monday morning, starting at 10 o'clock, stepping off from Chilhowie Park and proceeding up MLK Boulevard to Walter Hardy Park. And then also on Monday, the Beck Cultural Exchange Center, which we mentioned earlier in the program, they are having a day-long sort of special exhibits and activities and vendors and so forth at their place there on Dandridge Avenue. Also, we had a story this past week about the Mabry Hazen House, the historic home in East Knoxville. They are doing special Juneteenth themed tours. They were doing some on Saturday, but they have some scheduled on Monday as well, which are free and which kind of take you through that historic home and property, but with an emphasis on the perspective of the people who actually worked there, the initially enslaved people, and then in subsequent decades the domestic servants, but many of them black. So kind of trying to tell those stories at that setting as well. So lots of different things going on for the holiday.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about Juneteenth earlier, I'm way over here actually, that it's it's kind of a wonderful way it came about, but also kind of a sad way that it came about. I mean, one of the things is that the Civil War was the most kind of the watershed moment of our history. The end of slavery was the end of basically an evil practice that kind of since we're a little literary today, that Faulkner wrote about the about how that was our basically our the America's original sin, and but there never been an overall holiday celebrating the end of slavery. Probably mostly because America was still a predominantly white country and also wanted
deeply racist
and wanted to put let's just the recent unpleasantness, let's put it behind us, and it's so much so that there was never. I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, it was issued on January 1st of 1863, so there's already a holiday on January 1st. The passage of the 13th Amendment ending slavery was in December of 1865, early December. Those were never celebrated, really. And growing up as a white guy in a small town in East Tennessee, I never heard of Juneteenth. It never was part of. I mean, I just was and it's kind of an odd holiday too, because the origins when that a relatively obscure major general in the Union Army named Granger shows up in Galveston, Texas, and tells everybody there that the emancipation. Of course, remember, communication wasn't exactly swift back in those days. At the end of the war, after the end of the war, actually in 1865, shows up in Galveston and says, "Oh, hey, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation a couple of years ago, and
the war's over.
And slaves are free." And it was a very localized kind of the next year they kind of celebrated locally in Galveston, but it ended up spreading all throughout the African American community, all across the country. And that was the day that it just ended up being, the day that African Americans celebrated it, which in a way is just a kind of a neat thing that this holiday wasn't imposed on the outside, and it was just kind of bubbled up as as kind of the people's holiday in the African American community, and now, of course, it's being recognized nationally. But it's interesting that it comes from such a big picture historian would look at as kind of an insignificant event, because there were places all over the South where Union generals and would come into town and say, oh, the African Americans, you're free. Of course, things weren't easy after that, of course, as we all know, but, it was, for some reason it bubbled up from Galveston and has gone, and now is celebrated nationwide by everyone.
Yeah, and of course, we here in East Tennessee, the African American community for years has had its own holiday on August 8th, celebrated as Emancipation Day, which I believe connects to former President Andrew Johnson having liberated
his own
enslaved people at his plantation in Greenville.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of, and probably there were other sort of regional celebrations keyed to specific events.
Yeah.
And, people here, like the Beck Cultural Center, for example, still also celebrates August 8th. And so it's kind of Juneteenth isn't so much displacing that as complementing it in a way. The other thing that struck me thinking about Juneteenth is that it's an interesting sort of bookend to Labor Day at the other end of summer, because we think about Juneteenth and emancipation kind of from this racial standpoint that it freed African American slaves, but it was also the end of slavery was important for everybody, and basically saying that this is no longer an acceptable model of labor in America for anyone is a fairly substantial statement to make, and had ramifications for the labor movement as well. Mm-hmm. And so I think that everybody, there's always a danger here, and I've seen people talking about this online some, is it's like, it happens to some degree with Pride Month as well. When you take something that is a celebration sort of or for a minority group, particularly a historically oppressed minority group, and turn it into a holiday for everybody, there's always that sort of fear of like appropriation, or like, are we going to end up with, Juneteenth sales at the, supermarket, or the kinds of things you see around President's Day or whatever. Nevertheless, obviously a major holiday that marks something important in American history, and we will have some events here to celebrate it. Because Juneteenth happens the holiday is on Monday. County Commission, which typically holds its monthly work session the third Monday of the month, will instead hold that work session on Tuesday. And not a super exciting looking agenda, but there are a couple of interesting things on it, including a report from CTAS, the County Technical Advisory Service, which is operated out of the University of Tennessee, about Knox County's fire protection services, making some recommendations on maybe some things Knox County should think about there. So we will have coverage of that. And Scott, you're going to get to, I usually cover our county legislature, but as we mentioned earlier, I'm not going to be here, so you get to go to county commission.
I get to go to county commission. It's fun. I always enjoy going to county commission. It's not change of pace. Yeah. I don't get to see county commissioners as often as I see city council members, so that's always good. It's an interesting group, and yeah, I mean this fire services report is pretty interesting. From what I've seen of it, it's a long report. There's also another report that's coming out on Tuesday, where criminal court clerk Mike Hammond is going to kind of lay out how the mental health court is going to, which is new, how it's going to operate. It's new. It's basically a way, once people are in the criminal justice system, to get treatment for people with mental health issues that have caused them to get into the justice system, rather than go to jail. I mean, it's basically another way to keep people who have mental health issues from going to jail and getting treatment instead. He's going to have a report earlier on Tuesday about exactly how they're going to run that.
Yep, and we wrote a little bit about that a few months ago. You can find on our website about sort of the basic idea of it. And so, Mike Hammond is going to give sort of a progress report on actually getting this thing going. That will be interesting. So Scott and Seth will be here next week to talk about all that and anything else that happens. And
you're going to be reporting from the Aegean. And
that's right. The wine dark sea.
Yes. Golly, we're awfully literary today.
We are. Let's see what that's all about. And I'll be back in a couple of weeks, and see you all later.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.